How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 324 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is covering a couple of listeners' questions, and one of them is a question that keeps coming up time after time, and it's a surprising question actually that it keeps coming up. But it's one that, yeah, seems to be stumping people, and they definitely seem to be getting wrong advice as well. So, come to that one in a second. Um, the weather has eventually started to warm up quite a bit here after a very, very cold start to the week. We've had some lovely warm and growthy days. And yeah, we're definitely looking for, some sort of steady, warm weather as we move through April because growth has been slow so far. You couldn't, in most areas, you wouldn't sow seeds outside yet. It's still too cold. Still, in a lot of cases, the ground is too wet. But we're definitely getting to the point where, we can get going. It has been a kind of a stop-start spring, a lot of cold weather, a lot of wet weather, and ground is generally a little bit wet still. So, but when you get to this time of the year and you do get warmth, you get a little bit of sunshine, a little bit of wind, things dry up really, really quickly and we can get going. I know a lot of people have, potatoes in the ground and they have a good bit done. But generally speaking, outside it's cold. There's not any great warmth or kindness in the soil yet. So we're still waiting for that kind of prolonged, that 10 days that I talk about where you get, kind of 10, 12, 14 degrees for 10 days. Then we kind of go. And hopefully we're going to get that looking ahead. It's warm enough for the next few days and then a little bit of a small cold snap. But again, beyond that, looks kind of warm again. So fingers crossed, we're getting to the point where we can get up and running. So, listener's question, and this first question is a question that I answered. I answered about a month ago by a direct message on Instagram, but also there was a follow-on email to that and from the same listener. And on top of that, then over the course of the couple of grow your own food workshops this spring, it was a repeat question that came up on multiple occasions. So it's one that kind of people don't are a little bit unsure on. And it relates to raised beds, particularly raised beds in a polytunnel or a greenhouse. And the first listener, basically what had happened was they had bought their polytunnel. They had gone to their local garden centre to get the growing media to fill the raised beds with. And they were advised to put down ground cover fabric and then the put the growing media in on top of that. And the question was asked in relation to soil health and whether that was a good thing to do or the wrong thing to do. And definitely for me it's the wrong thing to do. So in a raised bed, what you typically have, depending on the level or the height that you're going to come up, but most people work with kind of lifts or boards of kind of nine inches or thereabouts, 20 centimeters or thereabouts. And even with one lift of 20 centimeters, let's say, you're going to have a good bit of growing media on top of, whatever is there, your grasses and so on. I would be using cardboard as opposed to ground cover fabric. I don't know what the thinking was. So this was a recommendation from a garden center. I'm not sure what the thinking was in terms of using the ground cover fabric. In a position like that, it doesn't have any benefits really. So what you do is you put down your cardboard, and that cardboard blocks out any grasses or any weeds that are there. I would take out any noxious weeds initially, if there's something like nettles or something along those lines, I would dig those out. But out from that, I wouldn't be looking to put down something as heavy as a ground cover fabric. Number one, there's no need for it. Um, but the biggest reason for me is that when, and anyone that listens to the podcast for a long time, what we're trying to do as much as possible in raised beds is we're trying to replicate and introduce the native soil life that's there, improve the soil life that's there, improve the soil health that's there, because when that is improved, when that is, working as it should, then everything up on top is much better. And when you put down a heavy plastic based ground cover underneath your growing media, you're basically isolating what's on top. Now, it is difficult in a polytunnel situation or a greenhouse situation to maintain healthy soil life at times, because obviously you get a lot of heat in there, you can get a lot of drying in there. And both of those things can be detrimental to soil life. So you're trying to always maintain moisture, maintain moisture, particularly in that top layer, and that can be difficult. But the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to start by isolating it from the native soil. And with, plastic ground cover, that's what you're going to do. So by putting that down, you don't really get the soil life moving up and down. You don't really get, now earthworms are not, you don't get a lot of them in tunnels anyway. You certainly don't get them up high in tunnels because the soil temperature tends to be a little bit too warm for them. They will be there, but they'll be maybe a little bit deeper, or they'll be sort of under plants or under the shade of plants. So you get them in areas like that. But when you have raised beds, particularly, it can be difficult to get them up in it, and it can definitely be difficult to keep them in it. But having said that, if you have a layer of plastic, you're not getting them in there anyway. So definitely for that listener to now, they had gone up a couple of boards, maybe two, possibly three, and the challenge then is the beds are already filled. Do you remove do you remove the all the growing media that you've put in there, and then try and remove that plastic membrane or that ground cover membrane afterwards, and then refill it, which is quite a lot of work. Um, I think ideally you would try that. If you couldn't do that, I would certainly dig down and cut out squares, so that you're able to open access at least at certain points. That would be helpful. The biggest thing going forward, though, is to make sure that the moisture in those raised beds always maintains, at a reasonable level. Um, I would continue to mulch down, even with live clippings, with grass clippings off the lawn, just small amounts to keep feeding once you get that soil life in there, to keep feeding it. And because what a lot of people find is they get their growing media, they fill their raised bed, they get really successful for year one and year two, and then you start to see it deteriorating, and the soil gets depleted, or the growing media gets depleted. And people often in year two, year three, year four will refer to things that are not growing nearly as well as they were. But what's happened is the soil life has just died. And what you're looking to do is reinvigorate that and try and keep it alive, mimic the outside as much as possible. And that's what you're trying to do. So if you're in that position where you have your polytunnel, your greenhouse, whatever the case may be, and you're setting it up, as I know a lot of people are at the moment, you're putting in your raised beds, and you're wondering, you know, what should I do with, you know, under these raised beds? Definitely the maximum you need to do is put cardboard down. So do not put, ground cover, do not put plastic membranes. There is no need for it. Number one, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money, but also it's detrimental to the soil life. You're not going to get that native soil life up into the beds, which is what you want, because you want that soil life to create a healthy soil, which in turn creates the healthy plants up on top. So you put down your cardboard, you put in your growing media. Typically, you're talking about something like a good quality compost. That's what you're looking for. You're looking to keep that moisture. You're looking to keep plant cover on it as much as possible. So, if you decide that you're putting in potatoes into this raised bed, they'll be coming out, within a polytunnel situation in at this stage. If you're planting now, you're kind of end of June, but you want to have something ready to go in there straight away. You want to always have plant cover on that bed, and then ensure that it doesn't dry out. It's something tricky, because I've been guilty of that myself. It does, if you have, certain crops in certain beds, you'll tend to them. But if there's a couple of beds where you don't, are not in use at that time, you do forget about them, and but you do need to rejuvenate them. But if you have put a plastic layer there, it's very, very difficult to get them going again. Once that soil life is dead, once that soil itself is dead, it's very, very difficult to reinvigorate it and to restart it. It is possible, but it's quite difficult. So, to answer this listener's question, and questions that have come up all over the spring, if you are putting raised beds inside in a polytunnel or a greenhouse, there is no need to put a ground cover fabric down initially. What you're looking for cardboard that will do the same purpose, which is to block out the sunlight block out the light to the grass or whatever it is that's there, and then you layer it down heavily in the first year with your growing media. And yeah, the height, then how high do you go with those raised bed? That really depends on yourself. It's it's for me, it's a you're thinking. So if you are somebody who has potentially, a bad back or mobility issues of any sort, then I would come up as high as possible with that raised bed, because it will make your life easier. It'll make it easier to garden. You're not going to be stooped down as low. If you don't have, then I don't, there's no great need for raised beds. If you don't have, if you don't have mobility issues, grow on the ground. You'll have the exact same space. It's a lot easier to maintain them. They don't dry out as easily. So it's just depends on your situation, depends on, where you're at. But raised beds are brilliant. They'll grow great crops. They just take a little bit more minding, and they're ideal if you do have a sore back, or you have, problems with your back or mobility issues or anything like that. Out from that, then ground beds are as good. There's no downside to having ground beds, especially if you're fit and healthy and able to work at that lower level. So that's that question. The second question that has come in, and it's one that I know a huge amount of people will be looking at, will be struggling with, and it is moss in lawns. And yeah, it's after being, as we've said, a very, very, very wet sort of 6 months here in Ireland. And if you're maintaining a lawn and you have been keeping it, the grass cut short, inevitably with the level of wet that we've had, you will start to see moss building up. And there's a few ways you can deal with it. It's a much debated topic at the moment, is the maintenance of lawns, and the application of things to lawns. But there's a lot of people that absolutely love their lawns. They love the stripy cuts. They love the fresh, clean cut look on it. And if that's what they love, and that's what they want to maintain, then that's their choice. What you can do. So number one, depends on the level of moss that's in the lawn. That's kind of a critical point in terms of what you would do, or your level, the sort of method of approach. So number one option is to scarify. Scarifiers are basically a machine that is used to essentially ruffle up the surface of the lawn, and they can be got in most hire centres. They're quite small in terms of width, so they might only be like 30 or 35, maximum 40 centimeters in width. So they're not going to be very wide, meaning that it will take a little bit of time to do this, but they're highly effective. So what they do is they go in and they scratch up the surface. They basically pull up all that moss, and that thatch is the dead grass that sits underneath the green that you see, and it kind of mats up. And when that mats up, it sort of prevents new grass coming up and encourages things like moss or weeds to push up. So the fresher and the stronger your grass is grown, the less vulnerability to things like moss. So basically, this machine starts off, it ruffles up the surface, pulls up that moss, and it leaves it sitting. And now, some of them come with a little bag. You probably won't use the bag because, to be honest, you won't get 5 meters down the lawn and you'll be emptying it again. So what most people do is they will scarify, scratch up the surface, leave the bag off so that the this thatch and this moss just sit on the top of the ground. Then they'll come along with the ride-on lawnmower at a higher setting, and they'll pick up all that grass, or their ordinary lawnmower, whatever the case may be, and they'll pick up all that moss and they'll take it away to their compost heap or whatever. Um, in that process, it depends on, so your next step kind of depends on the level of moss. But most lawns at the moment, or patches of lawns at the moment, are have moss levels of 50%, where the grass is 50% and the moss is 50%. And in a scenario like that, you if you want to maintain a really fresh, vibrant looking lawn, then you're going to have to do a little bit of reseeding. So the process is, with in this method, you scarify, you take away that moss. Then, if you need to, you would apply a little bit of a compost or a soil, basically something that you just shake along the surface, very, very light covering, and then you seed down on top of it and you roll it in and water it if it needs, if it's not, if there's not rain within the next day or two. And that process basically completely rejuvenates and you get a real fresh flush of growth. And now your green, vibrant lawn is back. So that's process one for getting rid of moss. Other options include, there are bacterial based treatments out there. There's several names of them out there. They're a very good, essentially they're a bacteria that will eat thatch and eat the moss that's there. It's a very, very slow process. So if you have moss in a lawn and you treat it, you won't notice any change within a week, even 2 weeks. And it's a very, very gradual reduction of the level of moss within the lawn. And that's something that, you will notice, but it will take maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks to notice it. The challenge with those is you need to start with a percentage moss that isn't greater than 30%. If it's more than 30%, then you either need to apply it on multiple occasions, or you need to do something like scarification first, because the level of bacteria in it is just not enough to take out a moss level that's above 30%. So they're brilliant products if you're starting with moss levels below 30%. Again, if you are starting below 30% and you have applied it and it has worked, again, another critical factor is temperature. So temperatures will need to be 12, 14 degrees. The bacteria in that just doesn't activate, doesn't work below that temperature. So if you apply it, it won't die, but it will not activate, will not get going until the temperatures are higher. So those products are really effective. But if you have 30% moss and you apply it, then in a couple of weeks' time, you will need to, do your reseeding or your overseeding again. And that's a really good way of reducing moss. Another way is by using something like a sulfate of iron. Now, this is a different process again. So sulfate of iron is essentially a product that's going to turn the moss black, and turn the moss black very, very quickly. So you apply it, your moss will go black, your moss will die out, then you can rake out your moss, but you do have to rake it. That's the beauty of the bacterial system, is that you don't have any raking, but with this one you'll have to rake or scarify. So it's another step that you will need to do. in terms of effect though, if you're starting at sort of 50% and you apply it, you will notice the very next day, you will notice a blackening of the moss. You will notice the moss dying off, but it does have to be raked out. If you don't rake it out, what ends up happening is it actually comes back in another layer below the layer that you have just killed, and it'll come back much, much stronger. So, yeah, for me, scarification is the best option. It's a little bit slow on on the one day, but it does give you a much better, it gives you a much better, I suppose, removal of the moss if that's your aim. But it also gives you a very, very good sort of bed to bed in your new seed into. And it's very, very quickly you can end up with, your lush looking lawn again. For anyone that is considering or looking at the likes of robot mowers, they're proven really, really effective at reducing the levels of moss in lawns. So this constant, very, very light clipping of the lawn, that is, a major tool in keeping the lawn healthy. So it keeps growing vibrantly green. You are feeding it on a regular basis with that little clipping of the lawn, but also keeping it tight makes the grass tiller, which is essentially means that the grass, instead of the grass pushing upwards, it pushes sideways, it tillers into the ground, and that blocks out any moss coming. So anyone that is using the robotic lawnmowers, they're finding very, very little, moss in their lawns and much healthier lawns generally. So that's another option, to go. But I know some people love their lawns. The person that asked me this question absolutely loves their lawn. They love going out and mowing it. They love the stripes on it and so on. But they have quite a lot of moss after a very, very wet period of time. So for me, scarification is the best option, but you do have other options as well. But scarification, while it takes a little bit of time on day one when you do it, it's more successful at removing it, and then it leaves a lovely bed for you to do a reseeding job or an overseeding job onto that bed, onto that lawn. So that's probably the best option. So that's the two listeners' questions. Something else I just wanted to talk about. There's only just 5 spaces left now in the workshop with Laura Darcy. So basically, this is a grow your own medicinal herb workshop, and it's sort of a different take on the workshops that I did in the springtime. So they're grow your own food. They're just myself, but now I'm bringing in the expertise of Laura Darcy, Yarrow Lane Herbs, who's a community herbalist. So she does herbal community consultations. She's runs courses, so she teaches people how to. Firstly, her initial one, how to basically become used to using medicinal herbs for everyday aches and pains, colds and flus, and so on. All of the normal ailments that you would have as a family. She has a sort of a beginner's course that takes you through those. Then she has an advanced one that is for people who kind of want to get into the world of herbal medicine or want to become, a herbalist themselves. And she has those courses coming up. But she is a fantastic, she's a fantastic herbalist. She's very good plants person, loves talking about plants, spotting plants, using plants in different ways. And, it's a nice way to combine this workshop. So I'm going to look after the growing part of it. Laura's going to look after the medicinal side of it. So we're talking about 10 common herbs. We're going to create a garden with those, or a little herb garden with those. But we're also going to look at all of the other plants that you would see in your garden. Some of these we gardeners consider weeds, but they're highly useful, functional medicinal plants. And so on the list of 10, we're looking at things like chamomile, peppermint, lemon balm, calendula, thyme, sage, yarrow, rosemary, echinacea, oregano. So we're looking at all of those type. So flowers, herbs, and we'll be looking at medicinal uses for those. So just 5 spaces left. It's on Saturday, the 18th of April, and it's from 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. And it's always tends to be a nice day, and yeah, it's an interesting one and a sort of a different sort of angle where we're bringing together my growing expertise and Laura's herbal expertise, and you'll be able to look at all these everyday herbs and know how to use them from a medicinal perspective to keep yourself for all the normal things like colds and flus and bumps and bruises and lip balms and whatever. So we'll make different things like chamomile tea on the day. All those uses will be discussed, how to utilize these herbs. So 5 spaces, link is in the bio, or link is in the show notes. Link is on my website and all those usual places, but only 5 spaces left. So if you're interested in going to that, get that booking done now. We'll be getting back in the next week or two to the open garden features, and yes, some other interesting episodes coming up and guest interviews as well. But for now, that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.